Thank you everyone for sharing your lunch hour with us today. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm Ethel Badawi, president of APABA-DC. As many of you know, APABA-DC is the oldest and largest association of Asian Pacific American lawyers, judges, law professors, law students, and other legal professionals in the DC metropolitan area. We have served the APA community for the past 4 decades and have a 3-part mission. First, to shed light on issues facing the APA legal community and the APA community at large. Second, to promote the professional growth and advancement of our members. And third, to promote the involvement of our members in the community at large. For more information about our organization and to join us if you're not a member already, I invite all of you to visit our website at apaba-dc.org. I'd also like to thank SABA DC and CAMBA for sponsoring our event today. I'm thrilled to have Hamid Khan joining us today for a conversation on Afghanistan, how we got here, and the ways forward. Hamid is an expert in Islamic constitutionalism, issues of Islamic law in armed conflict and post-conflict justice, gender issues under Islamic law, and trends in modern Islamic political thought. He currently serves as Judicial Education Attorney with the Federal Judicial Center and as an intermittent lecturer of law at the University of Michigan Law School, his alma mater. Hamid has worked in the justice sector and legal development issues with many organizations, including the U.S. Department of Defense, the State Department, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, the UN, NATO, and the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. He also has experience in private practice and served as an assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Colorado. Hamid started his career as a law clerk to the Honorable Terrence L. O'Brien of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. He received his Bachelor of Science summa cum laude from the University of Wyoming and his JD from the University of Michigan Law School. These are just a few of the many achievements in Hamid's career, and I could continue on, but I'm sure he'd prefer to start the conversation on Afghanistan, which is why we are here today. And so on this note, let's get started. I just want all of you to know that this session is being recorded. And I have many questions for Hamid to start the conversation, and we'll open up for audience questions later in the hour. But feel free to type in any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll get to them as we near the end of the session. So, Hamid, welcome. It's been about a month since the Taliban regained control in Afghanistan, and the news from Afghanistan has been overwhelming at times and seems to have unfolded with unexpected speed. And before we sort of talk about the evacuation and now resettlement efforts, I think it'd be helpful to have a more thorough understanding of just the context for the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Can you just start by telling us, how did we get here?
Well, thank you first for having me. I appreciate it. And let me apologize in advance for the poor internet connection. But suffice it to say, the history that we're about to engage in really does date back really until the period of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the subsequent resistance efforts that were made by various groups to undertake efforts to both eliminate or minimize the threat of Soviet influence, and then subsequent to that, the ensuing chaos. So as for many of you know, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan with the intent to install a communist government, and that was met with ferocious resistance. Of course, that wasn't just limited to Afghanistan. It became a global struggle as the United States sought to extend and limit the Soviet influence in Afghanistan, and armed and supported the group known as the Mujahideen. Now, when we talk about the Mujahideen, however, we're talking about at least 7 discrete groups that were part of the ongoing Afghan resistance, and that resistance was met with both brutality and significant force. In 1989, the Mujahideen had prevailed against the Soviet Union, who subsequently withdrew, And between the period of 1989 and 1992, full-on chaos ensued. Now, this marked a departure by the United States, sort of a walking away, if you will. And subsequent to that, by 1992, the communist-backed government in Kabul had collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And from the period of 1992 till 1996, a group known as the Taliban arose. This group had basically two planks. First, to establish peace in the country, and then secondly, to have a level of commitment to avoiding war. And by 1996, they largely succeeded. In the chaos that Afghanistan had presented itself, here were the Taliban ensuring both security and safety for most of the remaining populations. But let's be fair, the Afghan population was diminished significantly with refugee populations in places like Iran and Pakistan, as well as a diaspora that extended all the way to the West. So here we come from 1996 to 2001, and that's when the Taliban basically tried to wrestle control of the entire country in their hands. As we all know, and 20 years ago marks the date, on September 11th, the attacks of 9/11 instigated a full-fledged intervention by the United States in October of 2001, and that, of course, led to the installation of the new government backed by the United States and the international community, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, that took control in 2001, and in 2004 established their first constitution. Now, of course, 20 years later, we see that the Afghan government, the current government, or the previous government, summarily collapsed, and that collapse brought back the Taliban to power. So that is a very brief 30 plus years in the making, and here we are almost full circle, where the Taliban are now making the similar promises to bring peace, to avoid conflict, and to ensure tranquility. But of course, as you rightly point out, the events on the ground are rapidly changing, and it remains to be seen where things go. But certainly, if the past is any indicator, it will likely be fairly chaotic.
So, I mean, that leaves really well into my next question. I mean, having that context, the Taliban is saying that they will reestablish Islamic law in Afghanistan, at least their version of it. And, we have a sense of what this has looked like in the past 20
Right.
years ago, and widely remembered as, I think, brutal. There were extrajudicial killings. I think it'd be an understatement to say that women and ethnic and religious minorities were mistreated, that Afghans left some basic freedoms. And so with that as the background, maybe you could just take us back and say, what is Islamic law, and what is the Taliban's interpretation of Islamic law?
Well, Islamic law is one of the oldest systems of jurisprudence, legal systems in the world. It's actually older than the common law that we here in the United States are quite accustomed to. And it began in the immediate period of the time of the Prophet Muhammad in the 6th century, proliferated, became expansive throughout where Muslim lands had predominated from the 6th century on. And it is a religious-based law, but a religious-based law that was largely the product of rational undertakings by individuals who were faced with the same legal questions that all legal systems are faced with, which is how to govern relations between individuals, how to govern relations between states, but quite differently than the Roman-based civil law system and the British common law system that many common law countries adhere to. Islamic law also establishes the relationship between persons and God. And therefore, a large chunk of the component, much like Jewish law, is devoted to ritual practice. So the content of that law largely sprung from the Quran, the sacred text of Islam, which isn't a particularly long text and isn't particularly legal. In fact, the first Harry Potter book is actually longer than the Quran itself. So you don't find much in terms of a litany of rules in this text. But subsequent to the death of the Prophet Muhammad, again in the 6th century, many saw that there was an additional source of law, and that was his particular practice and conduct during his lifetime. From there, as Muslims expanded both eastward and westward, and within a century expanded to what we now consider most of Asia, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe, the question became for most individuals was how to govern according to the dictates of this new religion. And what's interesting to note is that this new religion largely predominated in places where Islam was not the major religion, and therefore they had to deal and encounter themselves with minorities. They had to deal with issues of gender. They had to also deal with perhaps the more mundane tasks, but one that this audience will probably know well, such as the engagements of family, marriage, inheritance, contracts, and then the larger issues. Now, the system of law that I spoke about, however, was based on an idealistic system, an idealistic in the sense that it was divinely ordained. And despite the fact that it was divinely ordained, there weren't necessarily black and white resolutions on any one particular issue. And that meant that a whole body of interpretation resulted. That body of interpretation was undertaken by jurists. It gave rise to schools, education, but it also gave rise to different ideologies that looked at the text in different ways. Some looked at it with a strict interpretation point of view. Others looked at it from a more liberal interpretation. And depending on where you were in the Muslim land and depending on where you were in time, you could encounter multiple, even conflicting interpretations of what Islamic law was. As a consequence, one of the reasons why Islamic law has remained relevant to this day and is the practice of Muslims around the world, whether it be in the public sphere or in the private sphere, is because of this diversity of opinions. The aspiration, remember, about Islamic law is to be a divine law, but oftentimes the interpretation can vary widely. And that strength of diversity and the sanction that diversity is to be encouraged under Islamic law has meant that you will see various interpretations around the world. So, for example, women's head covering in places like Saudi Arabia will vary compared to the women's head covering you see in Turkey. You may encounter interpretations that allow for interest in certain countries and not in others. But suffice it to say that it is almost inextricably linked that no Muslim to this day does not adhere to some aspect of Islamic law. They could be private matters, whether ritual or not, or they could be public matters, such as living in an Islamic state. So when we talk about the Taliban, we are talking about one interpretation among a series of many. And as you rightly point out, this interpretation is both controversial and in many respects has become the source of a great deal of disagreement among Islamic scholars about whether the Taliban adhere to the broadest notions of Islamic law in their particular way of governance.
I mean, and so, sort of thinking about the Taliban's interpretation, I know that you wrote a recent op-ed in the USA Today saying that, and I'm quoting here, the only way to substantively engage actors like the Taliban is a willingness to engage them where their claims to legitimacy lie, Islamic jurisprudence, and that we must be willing to leverage the strength of Islamic legal legacy against those claiming to invoke it. What did you mean by this, and how can we reconcile these different interpretations?
Well, take for instance the fact that the Taliban, their nomenclature, their very name, invokes the idea of being students of Islamic law, and that is their ideology. They claim to be faithful adherents to Islamic law, but in substance, many of their practices create a mixture between customary laws of those in particular of the Pashtun peoples and classical notions of Islamic law. And that mixture does not necessarily always, is not always smooth sailing. So for example, one of the most pernicious issues that was witnessed by the Taliban in the 1990s, and one great concern by many activists around the world, is the treatment of women. Now, in Islamic law, there is absolutely no prohibition about, for example, a woman's role in the public space. But in Pashtunwali, the laws and dictates of the Pashtun peoples of places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, the idea is that women should be relegated to the home for purposes of maintaining male honor. Now, that mixture produces widely different results. So that, for example, with women who make a demand for political participation or to be economic engines in their society, can't always be reconciled with that particular example that you see among the Pashtuns. In fact, the very point that I made in the op-ed was re-emphasized by the foreign minister of Qatar, who in a recent visit to the Taliban only a couple of days ago, insisted that the interpretive notions that the Taliban adhered to, i.e. Relegating women to non-governing, non-political roles, was an anathema to other Muslim countries. Qatar, interestingly, despite being a monarchy, pointed out that women lead fruitful lives and also have their place in both the political and economic sphere in a Muslim majority country such as Qatar. Why would the Taliban be any different? So when I spoke about the ideology and the most convincing part about the Taliban's claim to their ability to govern is Islam. And yet at the same time, as we all can gaze at the Muslim majority countries around the world, the variety of practices, the variety of political beliefs, and even the fact that many Muslim countries have and have had Muslim heads of state belie claims that the Taliban are making that there is just one static, clear-cut, and unopposed rule when it comes to interpretations of Islamic law on issues such as women. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
I think that, I guess in some ways that's encouraging, right? Because we have examples of nations that may follow Islamic law that, we can rely upon to, as you say, sort of leverage the legacy against the Taliban's interpretation. And to that end, I think the United States involvement and other countries' involvement in Afghanistan over the last 20 years was there to help the national government, but also to sort of do some nation building, right? And I think the US alone has spent more on nation building in Afghanistan than any other country to build everything from infrastructure, democracy and governments, women's rights, education, and so on. And, what can we see? Can we expect any positive legacy from that investment? And will that, do you think, influence how the Taliban rules going forward? I mean, we have a generation of a population that's grown up under sort of different framework.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that point can be underscored more. The fact of the matter is the population that the Taliban governed over between 1996 and 2001 simply wasn't there. The institutions of governance were not there. Social media, innovations, and technology were simply not there. But more importantly, the Afghan population that you see now, even under the auspices of the Taliban, have made their voices very clear. One, that there will be a willingness on the part of many, despite concerns about fear, to make sure that their voices are heard. Two, that many believe in a more multicultural, multifaceted society predicated on a population that is far younger, far more diverse, and far more cosmopolitan than during the bygone era of their reign. Third, there is some sign that the Taliban are willing and they have to appreciate this reality. Remember, the Taliban came of age trying to stifle civil war, and in their midst now, they find themselves governing a population that is far different than their own, a population that is more ethnically diverse, whereas the Taliban are predominantly Pashtun. You see that the Afghan population includes a variety of different minorities. You also see a more educated population that is more worldly. The Taliban have indicated and have made known to individuals around the world that now their role is to govern. And whereas for the longest time, for the duration of the past 20 years, they saw themselves as part of a resistance. But as we all know, and if history is any indication, state building is quite a bit different than creating a resistance movement. And oftentimes, resistance movements have a very difficult time calibrating themselves towards statecraft. If any indication of the last couple of weeks is clear, the Taliban are having difficulty, for example, rousing state workers to return to their ministries and picking up the trash. And perhaps even more pernicious is the economic fate of the country. Without money and resources coming into the country, you may find that the population of Afghanistan, bereft of basic services, might well turn very decidedly against the Taliban in more ways than one, because when people have a lack of pocketbook, it doesn't matter what their adherence is, they want basic services.
Absolutely. So that leaves me with some optimism, I think, here. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I know that when I first reached out to you a few weeks ago when we were preparing for our conversation, you were quite busy in the evacuation efforts in Afghanistan. Can you share with us what your role was in that effort and what observations you had?
Well, as you know, when the United States left the embassy and when the current government or the then government in Kabul had collapsed, an evacuation ensued, both to evacuate American citizens as well as to what has been often termed as our Afghan allies. And that process was both hectic, it was difficult, it was fraught with a significant danger. And unfortunately, despite comments from the American government, many individuals remain. It's unclear the degree to which the number of American citizens still remain, but I, for example, represent at least 45 to 50 American citizens and green card holders who are still in Afghanistan, still seeking a way out and requesting on a daily basis that the State Department and others within the US government honor their wishes, meet their protection obligations, and evacuate them safely from the country. Unfortunately, despite calls for that evacuation, many of these individuals are still there. We are trying to convince the US government, who is frankly lost quite a bit of leverage in their ability to persuade the Taliban to allow safe passage. And while those commitments remain in place, there are many logistical hurdles to evacuating people from a country that has recently been taken over, that is landlocked, and for which the United States has limited relationships.
So, I mean, is your sense that the Taliban will cooperate? I think I saw in the news that the first commercial flight did depart from the country just a couple of days ago. And what happens now? How can we continue to sort of assist in those evacuation efforts now that that August 31st date has come and gone?
Well, there are two prongs. One, there is the resettlement efforts here in the United States, and which are also taking place around the world. And so those here and those present can certainly provide legal assistance and also just basic goodwill towards our future neighbors, because the process of resettlement will likely be tumultuous. Many are being processed at facilities across the country and will need to integrate into communities. Many of them also face a precarious situation with regard to their immigration status. And then finally, there needs to be follow-up to ensure that these communities, these newfound communities, are well taken care of and well integrated, because the United States made a commitment to many of these individuals, and that commitment needs to be followed through. On the secondary prong, we and myself and others, concerned individuals, but many here, can make sure that we are not forgetting those American citizens. I know it's only been a couple of weeks, but frankly, It is clear that much of the attention has shifted away from Afghanistan, from the major evacuation efforts. But I can attest personally that there are hundreds of American citizens, children, mothers, people who are caught in the crossfire, who are still in Afghanistan, still trying to seek a way out. And we are trying to bring both political and logistical pressure to try to bring them home. That effort is ongoing, but perhaps more than anything, bringing to bear pressure on the U.S. government to not forget these individuals is probably foremost in our minds right now.
And what do you see, what about this tension with sort of the population that's being evacuated and those Afghans that will stay in the country, those that we talked about, that, the generation that's been raised and has lived there under sort of a different mindset, a different framework? What do you see as a way forward for those that stay in the country? Perhaps they have, they don't have a way out, and that's their country, they're going to stay. Do you have some thoughts on what the way forward is for the country and its people?
Well, it's difficult to say for sure. It's mostly speculation about how long the hold of the Taliban will take place, given the diversity of its population, and frankly, given the lack of technical knowledge that many of the Taliban have. As I mentioned earlier, the Taliban have resorted to recruiting previous members of the government and trying to cajole and sometimes coerce them into returning to their government jobs. But of course, the problem with many of those is they have to be willing, they have to be paid, and frankly, there has to be a measure of legitimacy on the part of the Taliban to convince these same individuals to return. As to the larger population, I think it's going to be deeply disconcerting with respect to questions about a very young population being able to seek out education. And by the Taliban's own admission, this has been a repeated admission that they've made to various news outlets, that many of the Taliban, the rank and file, simply do not know how to distinguish between, for example, policing and military activity. So the things that we often take into account here in the United States or in other countries, where we draw distinctions between the idea of the concept of community policing and that distinction of law enforcement, is something that is causing a great deal of disruption in Afghanistan. And so I think that many in Afghanistan are seeing the cracks. I think that they are trying to figure out what their recourse is. For some, they've sought refuge in different countries, and that's likely to continue. On the other hand, the fact that the Taliban have not foreclosed the possibility of a more broad-based government, announcing only on September 7th that they would form an interim government, might presage that there is a window of opportunity for Afghans, those that remain, to better influence the outcome and hopefully produce a government that is more representative of its people rather than what is in place right now.
And just as a follow-up to that, just based on some of the comments you've made in terms of, the perhaps potential economic instability that the country may face, and do you have a sense of what that tension might look like in terms of aid for the country going forward if, the Taliban is in place?
Well, first and foremost, there are several different elements to our national security apparatus and those of the international community. Right now, the World Bank has frozen many of those of the financial reserves that would go to the country, and many countries have indicated an unwillingness to recognize the current regime now in Kabul. That will probably hamper efforts to deliver humanitarian assistance for countries in the West. At the same time, it should be mentioned that countries like Qatar, Pakistan, China have all indicated their willingness to support the Afghan people through humanitarian assistance runs. But over the long term, this is not a promising sign because of the Afghan people are much more populous. It will require a significant amount of investment in humanitarian aid to avoid a calamitous result current droughts in the country have reduced crop loads, and the foreclosing of international assistance routes that normally many took meant that remittances, a principal source of income of cash into the country, was limited. If you recall from the headlines in the immediate aftermath, Western Union and MoneyGram had suspended their operations in Afghanistan. And while those have resumed, there's a great deal of suspicion that using even international wire transfers could be a means to detect and interdict individuals on the ground. So it is a difficult situation fraught by a lot of complexity, and it's all beset by the international economic regime that we live in. And that is something that frankly, the Taliban may not be accustomed to and may be facing in very short-term reality.
You know, that leads me then to the sort of conversation about remittances leads me to then thinking about the Afghans who have been evacuated. I think I saw a figure that more than 100,000 have been evacuated. And what will happen to those evacuees?
Well, as was mentioned previously, the United States has made a commitment to some of those individuals through their SIV program and other visas, petitions made through the normal or the regular channels of immigration. And then there is a whole cavalcade of individuals who have been brought in through humanitarian parole. And that, of course, is a different species of immigration that needs to be dealt with, and for which even Homeland Security has not fully addressed. In the United States, there is also concerns being raised by some politicians that without proper vetting or proper evaluation of some of these humanitarian parolees, that it becomes a political issue and an anti-immigrant sentiment. So for those individuals, they have many hurdles to overcome, not just being able to resettle in an appropriate way, but then also being able to take up their place in society. As for the rest, and as for many other individuals, the Afghan diaspora, their role in a post-Taliban period remains to be seen. Many of them have left, but many have left family members behind. We're talking about large, extensive family networks. And the concern is that while some classes of individuals were allowed to evacuate, there are whole swaths of families that are left behind. And one wonders whether or not there could be visits upon or retribution made against those family members for those that have left.
And do you think that, of those Afghans, actually, before I ask this question, I just wanted to remind everyone to please submit their questions in the chat box, or I'll allow those to speak as well after I ask this follow-up question. Do you think that those evacuees have any leverage to help with the family members that are left behind, whether it's financial or helping their family members evacuate to wherever they are resettling?
The former seems much more likely. In other words, just to be able to provide remittances has long been a practice in many parts of the world, and certainly Afghanistan relies upon those remittances. But remittances alone will not make up for the loss of income that the government has now encountered, that loss of direct international assistance, jobs and the like. So it remains to be seen how that amount will be able to be addressed by the current government, to what extent other countries' interventions such as China and Russia might play a role in a future Afghan economy. As to the latter, I think that this is even more difficult. It's fraught with a great deal of difficulty, not only because while in the abstract, you could get Afghans to petition for their relatives, one of the challenges we are facing currently is the unwillingness on the part of the Taliban to allow individuals to leave. And I'm not talking about necessarily American citizens with passports, but those individuals that have green cards. For example, I have learned that on the ground, many of the Taliban checkpoints refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of these green cards because they don't believe that they're valid documents, even though for those in the audience, they would readily recognize them as a legal status. Take that reality and then extend it to various visa holders. So the United States could confer, or any other number of European countries or any other number of countries around the world. Take, for example, Albania, Uganda, countries around the world that have extended refugee status to Afghans. And if those individuals on the ground, particularly the Taliban, don't recognize their legitimacy, they may never be able to leave the country. So that right now is foremost in the minds of many people, that even with conferred outside legality, internally, many in the Taliban don't seem to be willing to allow people to simply leave.
And, perhaps forgive my ignorance here. What is the Taliban's interest in keeping those Afghans in the country, right? If they may be difficult to govern, they don't have the same ideology, why not let them go?
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you talk to some individuals within the Taliban, they would agree completely with that assessment, that it would be better for them to allow those individuals to proceed and leave the country. At the same time, consider the political ramifications. The Taliban have promised to sort of make Afghanistan great again, and their claims of being better, less corrupt, more influential, and more effective to the Afghan population is beset by the notion that everybody wants to leave. So for political purposes, it may not be in the interest of the Taliban to allow everyone to leave, because it raises the perception that this is no longer a place to be. So they're in a bit of a tightrope, because you're absolutely right. On one hand, they could claim, well, we simply don't want individuals who don't want to be part of our society to remain. But on the other hand, if our individuals are so desperate to cling onto airplanes and find a way out of the country and plead, what does it say about the Taliban's legitimacy in the eyes of the international community? Because right now the Taliban are trying desperately to open up the spigot of international aid and take their place among the international community, and that is undermined when you see individuals desperate to get out.
Absolutely. I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions from our audience here. Feel free to type a question into the chat, or go ahead and unmute yourself, or if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you to ask any questions.
We have a silent audience today.
Otherwise, I will continue. Okay, so we have a question here. Coming back to nation building, after Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, many began to question the entire enterprise of trying to promote democracy and the rule of law abroad. There are those same people would say, perhaps correctly, that the Taliban is stronger today than they were 20 years ago. On the question of democracy promotion, many would point not only to Afghanistan, but to Iraq, Libya, and other places. Does the experience in Afghanistan tell us that we should be doing less to promote democracy abroad? Do we overestimate our ability to nation build?
I think that the answer really lies in the degree of our commitment. There was an op-ed that was buried in the immediate aftermath of the discussion about Afghanistan, when President Biden made the claim, or asserted the claim, that we were not there to nation build. That really flew in the face of many efforts, including efforts that I led on the ground with Stanford University, and then later with USIP, to instigate what basically are the institutions of governance. And the op-ed, I think, rightly points out that there was never a full-throated commitment on the part of the administration to go in one direction. In the years that we were in Afghanistan, many would argue, many analysts and many of those who were present in Afghanistan said that the lion's share of concern and resources was devoted to security concerns and efforts like democracy building, efforts to build institutions were frankly either compromised or at the wayside. And as time went on, we're simply underfunded. So it's not to say that our abilities, the United States or any other country's abilities to democracy build are ipso facto fruitless or failures, but rather the question is, what is the measure of our commitment? In the Arab Spring countries, as the questioner points out, there were numerous efforts, but they were driven by fits and starts. And the question was our policy clear? And were we willing to back it with the resources necessary? Libya is a prominent case example of the fits and starts of a constitutional process that never has really reached any resolution. But at the same time, maybe that resolution was lacking because there wasn't a wholesale international commitment to see it through. I think we made strides in Afghanistan. I think that there is a great deal of promise in those efforts in that particular country. But I do believe that the effort to build democracies abroad is frankly a national security concern. It is also a concern for adhering to the dignity of individuals. And it's very difficult for the United States to stand on a pedestal of a foreign policy that opines upon the sanctity of human rights without then making sure that they're devoting efforts and resources towards maintaining that dignity. It remains to be seen whether we've all sort of lost faith in this idea of democracy building. But I think that there is no question that democracy building and building those institutions is a difficult task. It's not one that you can simply turn on a switch and have democracy. And we here in the United States, in this particular community, is probably front and center to the ebb and flow that democracy sometimes brings. And the wherewithal of democracy is our willingness to participate in. And that's the lesson from this country. We can only begin to imagine what that would be like in other countries, but certainly saying that democracy efforts abroad are meaningless or fruitless is to say that many of us, for example, in the legal community and in our various communities around the country, should sort of throw up our hands and give up on democracy as well. The effort is one that is tied to human dignity, and I think it's worthwhile.
And as an extension of that, I mean, do you see that this sort of, effort is also tied to national security? I mean, as a national security matter for the United States?
Well, clearly, I mean, if you read any textbook on international relations, one of the sort of unsaid but now become more explicit rules of international foreign policy is that democracies generally do not fight with one another. So to what extent are we talking about the price we pay for very costly wars? Now, I'm not here as a proponent of just going to war to build for the sake of democracy. But we know, if we know of anything, the cost to our citizenry, the cost to our soldiers, and the cost to human life comes at a great cost when we have to make there are conflicts. And on the flip side, if you consider the amount that it costs to help and assist in democracy promotion efforts and the like in a variety of different countries, that cost is minuscule in comparison. But if you were to look at the annual appropriations and say the US's foreign budget, the percentages of, for example, money devoted to defense and wartime spending are well beyond eclipsing any type of assistance that we provide countries around the world.
I can certainly appreciate that. And there's a follow-up question here as well. It says, can you expand on the strides we have made in Afghanistan, even if the wholesale effort, as you described, has not been made? You mentioned that the Taliban are governing a very different population than 20 years ago. Isn't that a population that hopefully grew up to some of our, exposed to some of our efforts? But I think we talked about that a little bit earlier, your efforts in particular to build a pluralistic and democratic Afghan society.
I'll give you one concrete example, and it's more of a facet of innovation and technology than it is anything else. But it was one that gained a great deal of attention over the past decade. And that Afghans, for example, are more connected by cellular technology than at any other time in their history. Now, you would be thinking that innovation alone could be both good and bad, and you'd be absolutely right, except that we know from examples in various countries that the level of intercommunication, the level of interaction itself can be quite remarkable. And whether that modality is the cell phone or the town crier, we have seen that mobilization efforts can largely be a wellspring of that innovation. Consider also that the Afghan population of over 30 million is far and away younger, more educated, and thanks to the actions of the United States and the international community, such that, for example, as you probably have seen on the media, the participation of women's groups, the participation of young individuals to resist the Taliban, and the responses that have to come as a result. So I think that there is both a demographic element to this, a demographic diversity that the Taliban have never contended with, and that was thanks to the security and the development efforts of the international community. And then on the other aspect is innovation. Innovation has percolated into places like Afghanistan, a place that more likely than not would have probably been forgotten if history had proven different. And I think that many Afghans, many of those who live abroad, many who live in the West, are keenly aware of the potential it has. In fact, the very fact that I'm able to communicate with many of these same Afghan individuals today via my cell phone and be able to mobilize efforts is itself a powerful indicator that all is not lost when it comes to the situation in Afghanistan. And frankly, even the Taliban have come to realize through their social media presence, through their media enterprises, through even their press conferences, where once shadowy figures now have to come out in the open, that is a far cry from where we were in 1996.
I have a follow-up question here, but before I ask it, any other questions from the audience? So I'll let people think on that for a minute. So based on that, like you were saying, and I read that, there are young people that are coming out to protest, and you're based on your prior comment that, the Taliban is walking this tight line with trying to show that they are a different, they will be different in the way they govern. Are you hopeful for the future of their governing and for the direction of the country?
I think it remains to be seen. It's interesting because I think if you're keenly aware of what's going on in the country, over the last several days, there has been a bit of a discussion going on, maybe something a little bit more vitriolic than a discussion among the Taliban's leadership. And if you've taken a glimpse, and if anybody has any interest, much of the makeup of the current interim government is largely composed of the old guard, that guard which presided over the 1990s. But many of these same individuals are also at odds with one another. Some members of the Taliban want to close ranks to ensure ethnic homogeneity and an ideology that is frankly more in line with the customary practices of the Afghan people perhaps a century ago. On the other hand, there are many individuals right now, including in the Taliban leadership, that want to see themselves as state actors. They want to make that transition from resistance to state acting. And they have an opportunity to do so, but they recognize that that opportunity means they may have to change. And one thing is true about the Taliban. Studying their ideology as I have for the last several years, they are prone to change. They are prone to wax and wane with the realities on the ground. Otherwise, their currency and their wherewithal probably would never have launched them back into the forefront of Afghan society. So they have shown a tendency to show compromise when necessary, and especially when the leadership makes it abundantly clear that commanders on the ground individuals in places like Kandahar and Herat, as opposed to those in Kabul, really need to toe the line. So I think the Taliban are doing a lot of thinking about how they're going to approach it. And then there are the external factors. Will there be an active resistance? Over the last couple of weeks, there was rumors of a resistance coming out of the Panjshir Valley. Media reports suggest that that has been crushed, but there remains a larger population, and the question is yet to be resolved about whether this larger, more ethnically diverse population will be able to resist. There's a significant Shia minority. There are individuals who are not necessarily Pashtuns. All of these are wild cards, and all of them remain unresolved right
now. Okay, I think we have another question here that says, can you expand on the concept of existing local communities, cultural fabric, and or social institutions that could be utilized to cultivate democratic change under the likely Taliban rule? How can we ignite change from within?
Well, the most important, I think one of the most important ways that the world community is now aware of what has happened with the population of Afghanistan are through the powerful narratives of many of the Afghan people. And those narratives were compelling. They gave rise to stories like the Kite Runner and others that captivated the attention of the West in the 1990s. Today, however, it's a little bit different. In much the same way that minority populations have been able to film the excesses of law enforcement here in the United States, I think that there is a strong likelihood that many individuals well-versed in technology will be able to make their stories heard and will be able to use the outlets of social media to do so. The question next becomes, to what degree and to what extent are the Taliban's intelligence services going to mitigate, stultify, or even eliminate any of the opposition? And that is an open question. I've heard only rumors about their capabilities, but I do remain hopeful that, akin to the human spirit, many of these individuals will get their stories out. I think that it's incumbent upon individuals here in the United States and around the world to be mindful of what is going on in the country, to be mindful of the fact that the situation in Afghanistan is fraught and it's difficult. And despite the claims that the Taliban have made of a wholesale claim to authority in the country, they are presiding over a population with at least 28 distinct ethnic minorities. And while they represent the plurality of the people in terms of their ethnic heritage, they don't necessarily represent every single aspect. Finally, I would also point out that the diaspora is an important part of this. Many of the individuals who served with the U.S. military and with the various militaries of the world have a keen insight into both the country and what will happen. And I think it's important for individuals to lean upon them to gain a real insight into this country. The last thing I will say is to harken back to something I introduced with, which is in 1989, the United States essentially turned its back. And that turning away led to the situation that led us to 9/11, a willingness on the part of the United States to sort of forget and sort of leave it to what it is. I don't believe that they will make the same mistake twice, but I do believe that if we simply sort of turn our backs, regard the situation of Afghanistan as inconsequential, it will come back to haunt us. And every situation that we have encountered on the international stage where we decide deliberately to turn our backs often is met by something more problematic in the near future. This is a telling tale, and one that we have been warned about for a significant period of time.
It's a heavy lesson, I think, that we need to sort of bear in mind. I think we have time for one final question, which is a slight pivot and hopefully slightly more optimistic, which is, do you have suggestions? We've encouraged our attendees today to make a donation to the International Rescue Committee's Afghan Families in the DC area fund. And we have a question that says, do you have any suggestions for how we can make those evacuees here in the DC area feel more comfortable? And what can those of us here in the local DC area who may not have, expertise and connections in this crisis, what can we do to sort of make an impact?
Well, there are a number of charities, Lutheran Family Services and Catholic charities, who are leading the way in terms of gathering donations. And I know for a fact that those drives for finding clothes, resources, even furniture, and of course, monetary donations will be essential to their resettlement. The current policy is to simply allocate resources towards their immigration, but beyond that, relocation is going to be a struggle for many Afghan families. So first and foremost, I think reaching out to these local charities, Lutheran Family Services and Catholic Diocese are two important players here in the DC area. I also think that there will be a growing and perhaps persistent need for legal services, pro bono services, to ensure that there are no immigration issues that are left undetected, because these are complicated and very nuanced immigration policies. So many of the members in the audience can leverage their legal acumen to help those individuals. And then finally, if you have donations of any kind, and they don't necessarily need to be donations of money, but they can be of clothing, of furniture, so that resettlement process can be a lot easier. That'd be one easy way to help a family or help a group in need.
Excellent. Well, that I think takes us up right to the 1 o'clock hour. So I want to thank you, Hamid, for your time today and sharing your expertise with us. I think it was a really enlightening conversation for those of us, like I said, who are not doing this work on a day-to-day basis, to provide this context for us and ideas for how we can continue to keep an eye on this important issue. So thank you for your time and your expertise. And thank you for all the attendees today for joining us for this important conversation.
Thank you very much.